You think you know why you do what you do. You think you know why you said what you said. Why you reacted the way you reacted. Why you chose this person. Why you avoided that conversation. Why a certain room makes you tense before you've consciously registered anything wrong. You think you're aware. Most people do. And that assumption, that quiet confidence in your own self-knowledge, is exactly what makes the patterns invisible, not because you're not intelligent, not because you're not paying attention, but because the most powerful influences on your behavior don't announce themselves. They operate underneath the level where attention normally rests. In the automatic, in the habitual, in the spaces between your conscious thoughts, where decisions are already being made before you've had the chance to make them. Tonight we're going into those spaces, not to make you paranoid, not to make you distrust yourself, to make you see what was always there that you were never quite looking at directly. When most people hear the phrase dark psychology, they picture manipulation, someone running calculated moves on unsuspecting people, a game being played, and that exists, but it's the surface layer. The part that gets attention because it's visible enough to be dramatic. The deeper layer is quieter. It's about the patterns that run inside you and inside everyone around you that nobody deliberately installed, but that control behavior with extraordinary consistency. The automatic responses, the emotional reflexes, the ways your history shapes what you perceive today, without telling you that it's doing so. Real psychological awareness is not about spotting manipulation from the outside. It's about recognizing what's happening on the inside, in your own reactions, your own assumptions, your own blind spots. Because here's what most people miss. You cannot accurately read anyone else until you've started to read yourself. And most people never start, not because they don't want to, but because the self examined closely is more complicated than it appears. More automatic, more influenced, more shaped by forces that feel like choices, but aren't always. Today we're going through 5 layers. Each one goes a little deeper. Each one asks something slightly different of you. Not action, just attention. The kind of attention most people don't give to the ordinary moments of their own lives. Let's begin. There is a version of yourself you carry in your mind, a self-image, the story of who you are, how you think, how you respond to things. This story feels accurate. It feels like observation, like you've watched yourself long enough to know yourself well. But here is what the research consistently shows. The gap between how aware people believe they are and how aware they actually are is much larger than almost anyone is comfortable admitting. In 1999, 2 psychologists named David Dunning and Justin Kruger published a study. Their finding, which has since been replicated across cultures and contexts, was that the least competent people in a given area tend to significantly overestimate their competence, not because they're dishonest, because the skills required to evaluate performance in an area are the same skills required to perform in it. When the skills are absent, so is the ability to recognize their absence. But here's the part that applies to everyone, not just the less competent. Even highly self-aware people operate on autopilot for a significant portion of their day. Researchers estimate that somewhere between 40 and 95% of daily behavior, depending on the study and the context, is habitual, automatic, running on patterns established through repetition, without moment-to-moment conscious input. You are aware for less of your day than you think, and for the portion where awareness is present, it's often arriving after the fact, narrating what already happened, constructing reasons for decisions that were made before consciousness was involved. Have you ever explained why you did something, and then realized, somewhere in the middle of explaining, that the explanation didn't quite capture what actually happened? That the reason you were giving was cleaner than the reality, more logical, more intentional, more chosen? That's not dishonesty. That's the mind doing what it does. Building a coherent story about behavior that was partly automatic, filling the gaps with reasonable sounding cause and effect. And the story it builds feels true. That's the important part. It doesn't feel constructed, it feels like memory, like observation, like self-knowledge. But underneath it, the automatic is still running, shaping the next decision, before the story about the last one is even finished. So the question isn't whether you operate on autopilot. You do, everyone does. The question is, which patterns are running and where did they come from? Someone speaks to you, you form an impression, you decide almost instantly whether you trust them, whether they seem confident, competent, safe. You do this before you've processed the content of what they said, before you've had time to evaluate whether their words are accurate, before your conscious mind has weighed anything at all. This is not a flaw, it is a feature. The brain processes enormous amounts of social information: tone, pace, eye contact, micro-expressions, posture, in parallel, simultaneously at speeds that conscious analysis cannot match. It generates a result, an impression, and delivers that impression to you as a feeling, as gut instinct, as the sense that something is right or wrong about a person, without the ability to explain exactly why. The problem is that this system, fast and automatic and extraordinarily confident, is also shaped by everything that came before, by every previous experience of a similar tone, a similar posture, a similar pattern of speech. Someone speaks to you with the calm authority of someone who once let you down. Your nervous system registers the similarity, not consciously, but the impression forms around it. A slight unease, a held-back trust. And you don't know why you don't fully believe them, because you're not aware that you're running a comparison to someone from a decade ago. This works in the other direction too. Someone uses the warmth and timing and language patterns of a person who made you feel safe. Your guard lowers. Not because you've evaluated them, because your brain recognized a pattern and responded to the pattern rather than the person. Tone is perhaps the most powerful of these instruments, not the words, the way the words are delivered. Research consistently shows that when T1 and content conflict, when someone says something reassuring in a slightly tense voice, people respond to the tone. They trust the emotional signal over the verbal one. Think about that. The words could be saying one thing, and you could be responding to something else entirely. Something underneath the words. Something the other person may not even be aware they're communicating. This is why some conversations leave you with a feeling you can't name. Not because anything was said, because something was transmitted through the channels that operate below language, below awareness, and you picked it up without knowing what you were picking up or why it landed the way it did. The next time you form a quick impression, notice it, not to override it, just to notice it. Ask yourself, am I responding to this person or to a pattern they reminded me of? The distinction matters more than most people realize. You have patterns, everyone does. Not the ones you're aware of, not the habits you've identified and are working on, the ones you haven't noticed yet. The ones so embedded in how you move through the world that they don't feel like patterns at all. They feel like personality, like just the way you are. There is a concept in psychology called a schema, a mental framework built from experience that organizes how you interpret new information. You develop schemas early for how relationships work, for what safety feels like, for what it means when someone is quiet, for how much of yourself is acceptable to show, for when to speak and when to hold back. These schemas run continuously. They take in new situations and filter them, matching them to existing templates, generating expectations, shaping responses, before you've had a chance to evaluate the situation fresh. This is efficient. The brain cannot process every new situation as if it has never encountered anything similar. Schemas allow you to navigate a complex world without rebuilding your understanding of it from scratch every day. But the cost is that you sometimes see what your schema expects, rather than what is actually there. You read a neutral expression as disapproval because your schema tells you that quietness means something is wrong. You pull back in a relationship the moment it becomes comfortable, because your schema associates comfort with the moment before something disappears. You work harder than you need to, because somewhere early you learn that being enough required demonstrating enough. These are not character flaws. They are old solutions to old problems, strategies that made sense in the context they developed in, that have been running ever since, sometimes helpfully, sometimes in environments where they no longer apply. Have you ever had a reaction that surprised you? A response to something that, when you examined it later, seemed larger than the thing that caused it. An anger or a fear or a withdrawal that didn't quite match the scale of what happened. That mismatch Between the size of the response and the size of the trigger is often a schema being activated, an old pattern recognizing something it's been trained to respond to and responding. Before you could intervene, the first step isn't changing the pattern, it's seeing it. Recognizing the response before it has fully arrived, and knowing what it is gives you something you didn't have before, a moment, a small gap between the trigger and the action, and in that gap is where awareness lives. You are a constant interpreter. Every person you encounter, every behavior you witness, every silence, every word choice, every expression, you interpret, you assign meaning. You build a model of what's happening inside another person, and you treat that model as if it's accurate. Most of the time, it isn't, not completely. The first reason is projection. The tendency to attribute to other people the thoughts, feelings, and motives that are present in yourself. When you are feeling competitive, you read competitiveness in others. When you are feeling insecure, you interpret neutral behavior as judgment. When you are feeling distant, you read distance into the people around you. This isn't random. It follows a consistent psychological logic. The mind uses itself as the primary model for understanding other minds. It assumes that other people's inner experience resembles its own. And when the assumption is wrong, which it often is, the interpretation that follows is wrong too. But it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like observation. The second reason is confirmation bias. The tendency to notice, remember, and weight evidence that supports existing beliefs and overlook evidence that doesn't. Once you've formed an impression of someone, a positive or negative evaluation, your attention filters for information that confirms it. The person you trust, their mistakes are reinterpreted as accidents, their inconsistencies explained away. The person you distrust, their neutral actions become suspicious. Their kindness a strategy, you are not seeing them. You are seeing your model of them, confirmed continuously by selective attention. The third reason is the fundamental attribution error, one of the most consistently documented biases in social psychology. The tendency, when explaining other people's behavior, to overestimate the role of character and underestimate the role of situation. When someone is short with you, you conclude they are rude, rather than considering that they received bad news an hour ago, or didn't sleep, or are managing something invisible to you. You do this automatically. The attribution to character is faster and more satisfying than the investigation of context. Character is stable, predictable, useful for making future predictions. Context requires effort, so the brain, optimizing for efficiency, reaches for character and produces a judgment that feels like understanding. None of this means your impressions of people are worthless. They contain real information, but they contain that information mixed with projection, with confirmation bias, with attributions that say more about your mind's habits than about the person you're looking at. The question worth carrying into your next significant interaction is not only what do I see in this person, but what am I bringing to what I'm seeing? What is mine and what is actually theirs? Something changes when you start to actually observe yourself. Not just think about yourself. Observe. Notice the pattern as it activates. Catch the impression forming before it has fully formed. Recognize the schema running before it has produced its output. It's subtle at first. A small delay. A moment of recognition between the stimulus and the response. Oh, this is that pattern. This is that old response activating in a new situation. This feeling is real, but it may not be accurate. That delay, even a half-second delay, changes something fundamental. Not because you automatically make better decisions, but because you've interrupted the automatic. You've inserted consciousness into a process that usually runs without it. And the more you practice that insertion, the more available it becomes. The patterns don't disappear. They're too deeply established for that. But they begin to feel like patterns rather than like reality. And that distinction between a pattern you're running and the reality you're in is the difference between being controlled by something and being aware that it's there. There is a term in psychology called metacognition, thinking about thinking, awareness of your own cognitive processes, the capacity to observe the mind from a slight distance, rather than simply being inside whatever the mind is producing. People with higher metacognitive awareness make different decisions, not always better decisions, but different ones, more deliberate, more chosen, less dictated by patterns they aren't seeing. This isn't a skill that requires special intelligence, it requires practice. And it starts with something very simple: curiosity about your own reactions rather than just acceptance of them. The next time you feel an immediate strong reaction to someone, before you act on it, get slightly curious. Not doubtful, not dismissive, curious. Where is this coming from? Is it responding to what's here or to something it's reminding me of? The next time you find yourself certain about a person's intentions, ask one question: what would I need to believe about this person to see it differently? Not to change your conclusion, just to see if the conclusion was arrived at or assumed. The next time a pattern you recognize in yourself runs without your permission, don't judge it, just name it. Quietly, internally. There it is. That naming, that quiet internal acknowledgement, is not a small thing. It's the beginning of the gap between the automatic and the chosen. And in that gap, everything becomes slightly more yours. We've reached the end, and I want to leave you with something specific. Awareness is not power over other people. That's not what tonight was about. Awareness is the gradual reduction of the gap between what is actually happening and what your automatic mind tells you is happening. That gap for most people is significant. It's the source of most misread relationships, most disproportionate reactions, most decisions that felt chosen but were mostly automatic. Closing that gap doesn't make you invulnerable. It doesn't make you a perfect reader of people. It doesn't protect you from being influenced. You will still be influenced. That's not a failure. That's the condition of being human. What changes is that you begin to notice it. You begin to see the pattern while it's running. Rather than only in retrospect, you begin to ask the question, what is actually mine here? Often enough that the question becomes habit. And habits of attention are among the most valuable things a person can develop. Not because they change everything immediately, but because they change what you're working with. They give you information about your own mind that most people never gather. The 99% you're more aware than aren't unaware because they're incapable. They're unaware because nobody pointed them toward their own patterns. Because the patterns once established prefer not to be examined. Because the automatic is comfortable, familiar, feels like just the way things are. You've spent the last 30 minutes looking at it directly. That already changes something. Not everything, but something. Carry it forward. Not as suspicion, not as overthinking. As quiet, patient attention to what was always there, but wasn't always noticed. That attention is the beginning of actually knowing yourself.